Hey everyone, and welcome to this video. I'm Glenn, and this is episode 15 of the Oathsworn painting series. In this episode, I'm painting the Exile. If you're new to miniature painting, I hope you'll find this video interesting and helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comment section below. As usual, let's see how I went from a pristine unpainted miniature to this fully painted one. Let's begin. First, I removed all the mold lines by using a hobby knife. Then I assembled the model using glue, excluding the arms. To fill the gaps, I used the mixed sprue glue. If I need to even out the surface, I apply the pure glue. The glue is dry and I clean the model in soapy water, rinse it in clean water and let it dry. Then I primed the model with Chaos Black primer. Next, I used an airbrush to make a cinematic light effect by applying a white color from above. This can also be applied by using a can of white primer. Now we're all set and good to go. I began the painting process by base coating the entire model, starting with the skin using Bugman's Glow. For the leather straps between the legs and the handle on the weapons, I used Doombull Brown. For the hair, I use a black color. For the other leather parts and shafts on the weapons, I apply a mix of 2 parts Gravelord Grey and 1 part hardened leather. This also applies to the strap on top of the foot. For the metal parts, I use a mix of 3 parts Gravelord Grey and 2 parts Periwinkle Purple. To give the axe blades a darker appearance, I apply a second coat after the first layer had dried. I also define gloves on the hands. For the cape, I apply a range of speed paints randomly. The goal is to give it a weathered appearance using tones of green, brown and orange. I make sure the paint doesn't pool too much. I let the brush soak up the excess and then wipe it off on a cloth. I use a similar process on the fur and the bone parts. To define the skin further, I apply a coat of Crusader skin over all the skin areas. The speed paint is dry, and now I add a bit of color variation to the bone parts and fur. I use pallet bone, orc skin and fire giant orange. This adds a more interesting look to these areas by adding this hint of green and orange. For the leather parts and weapon shafts, I enhance the saturation with hardened leather. To define these leather straps, I use Crusader skin. I also apply a thin coat of pallet bone onto the cape to blend the colors further. The base coat is complete and the model looks something like this. Now I begin to layer and highlight the model, starting with the bone parts. I use steel leading drab, bone white and Oathsworn grey. I also incorporate Lauren Forest to add a tint of green where desired. I start with a thin coat of steel leading drab. I want to preserve some of the underpainting or base coat from the previous step, so I avoid applying a completely opaque layer. With each new layer, I gradually move towards the exposed and raised areas, building up the highlights. I continue on the other bone elements using the same process. On these horns I paint the layers as thin lines to add some texture. The bone parts are complete and the model looks something like this. For the fur I use a similar process, utilizing medium gunship grey, steel-eaten drab, Oathsworn grey and black. I incorporate a grey color into the fur to distinguish it from the bones. On the Exile's left side, where he has a flat surface, I paint thin, uneven lines to create the appearance of fur. Here I apply pellet bone and ox skin to give this flat area the same tone as the other fur. Afterward, I reapply all the fur layers to ensure it looks consistent with the other areas. Next, I continue working on the remaining fur parts. I keep the fur slightly darker in the less exposed areas to maintain depth and contrast. For the leather parts I use scrag brown, tau-light ochre and bone white, starting with scrag brown. I used a mix of tau-light ochre and bone white to paint some texture. I continue on the other leather parts using the same process. I basecoat the gloves with Mournfang Brown, keeping the crevices dark, and then I simply layer and highlight them using the same colors as previously. On the pouch, I use Mournfang Brown, Taulight Ochre, Lauren Forest and Bone White. I follow a similar process, mixing and alternating between these colors to create a textured leather effect. I use a bit of black to outline the pouch. On the leather between the legs, I use Dumble Brown and Taulight Ochre. I gradually highlight the leather by mixing these two colors. For the cape, I use the colors listed to the side. As I apply lighter layers, I add textures to give the cape a weathered appearance. My goal is to achieve a dirty look by incorporating Mournfang Brown and Lauren Forest. Additionally, I create some orange or brownish areas using Scrag Brown and Taulight Ochre. For the most part, I paint lines and stipple on the paint during this process. I use a similar process on the underside of the cape, but I avoid overly bright colors to maintain contrast. For the leather on the handles, I use a mix of Deepwood brown and Fenrisian grey, and gradually use a lighter tone by mixing in Oathsworn grey. I paint wood grains along the shafts using scrag brown and bone white, adding multiple layers to build up the texture. For the metal parts, I use the colors listed to the side. I start by applying spots of scrag brown and Lauren Forest to give the armor a bit of color. Once these colors are applied, I begin using the non-metallic metal method. I use Dark Reaper, Fenrisian Grey, Oathsworn Grey and White, gradually building up the layers in this order. To ensure smooth transition on the metal parts, I mix the colors together as I move through the layers. You can follow along with the color banners and on the wet palette. I apply this technique to the small metal bits on the model as well. For the sharp edges on the axes, I create a few focal points along the edges. I also incorporate black to add high contrast to these focal points. I use the same process for the other sharp edges to achieve a consistent look. For the flat areas, I add some color as dirt or rust. Using the stippling motion, I apply Dumble Brown and Scrag Brown to achieve this effect. Afterwards, I paint scratches using Ulfern Grey and white. To clean up the scratches, I use the brown colors, Dark Reaper and black. I apply this whole process to all the other sides of the axes, keeping the two less exposed sides slightly darker. Continuing with the skin, I use a range of skin tones starting with Bugman's Glow. I gradually lighten the skin as I build up the layers, creating subtle shadows between the muscles. I alternate between the skin tones to ensure smooth and neat transitions. I apply this process to the rest of the model, starting with the sides and adding shadows beneath the armpits. For the chest and face, I apply the final highlight using a mix of Cadian flesh tone and pale flesh instead of Kislev flesh and pale flesh to achieve a warmer tone. I paint the tongue using Buckman's Glow, followed up by Familiar Pink, I apply Oathsworn Grey on the teeth, and also into the eye sockets. Then the pupil using black. Followed up by a beard on the chin. To add a bit of warmth to the skin, I use Familiar Pink, applying it thinly. It's always possible to apply more. If needed, I let it dry completely before I add another layer. This is also applied onto the scars. If I happen to apply too much, I rinse the brush to soak up the excess. For the most part, I apply this towards the shadows and the different elements of the model. And I also apply this in between the muscles. When the Familiar Pink is completely dry, I apply more on the scars. Afterwards, I stipple a light skin tone onto the scars and paint some eyebrows using black. And for the hair, I use grey, brown and black, applying these colors along the hair to give the hair a bit of variation. Next, I highlight the hair using a few mixes listed to the left. I apply these colors along the raised edges and use black for cleaning up in between the raised edges. I move on to the base and paint it as I have done in previous videos, applying speed paints onto the base in a random manner. I follow up with highlights and details using a range of colors. I go the 2 laps around the base rim with a black color. Then I attached tufts, leaves and flowers to the base using superglue. And as the final step, I applied Matt Varnish for a matte finish and to protect the paints. And with that, let's have a look at the final result.
I was once a son of a scartribe, forged in the treetops. We learned to lure our prey with our own blood and descended from the canopy to show them the one and only true god, death. I was ascending to be the next pack leader, but a cunning rival, knowing he wouldn't stand a chance in a duel, schemed with lies and betrayal to have me exiled. To draw breath another day, I must leave the past behind. With no other place to go, I gladly take the oath. As we traverse the Deepwood, with me as part of its pack, we hunt, and I hunt for the kill. Accursed creatures stand at our gates, and the Painting Chronicles Brotherhood stands at the ready to face this evil. Join our cause by subscribing, and we shall triumph together. Pillar and Path Brothers. Also like and comment.